Nowadays, some of our villagers' most intimate possessions are encased in the great museums of the world. This little room in Turin probably has more recorded Egyptian history in it than any other room in the world. These, you see, are unrolled rolls of papyrus on which the scribes have written. Here, court records of a royal trial. This, the oldest map in the world. But this papyrus is the one we've come to see. It's a bit of a tatty relic, but the world in it is magic. Look at this little head. It's a little animal playing a double flute. It's the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Underneath is a bird climbing a ladder. That's a balmy thing for a bird to do. This bird can't fly. All the animals in this papyrus are actually doing strange and insane things. This is a modern copy because, as you can see, the original's a bit tatty, but you can actually work out what's going on here. And what you see is this absolutely insane world. A donkey, a bad animal being a priest, all sorts of weird, wonderful things in it. Now, this may look like a comedy, but it's no joke, this basically unstable, topsy-turvy world. And there is another sort of drawing upon this strange papyrus. They show 12 couples of the villagers making love. It's an erotic papyrus. It's the only one that survived. Extraordinary document. Just think about it. What it shows you, in this one long, thin strip, you can divide it down the middle. One half is stressless, tenderful, loving, centerfold, if you like, no time in it at all. The other side, all these mad, crazy animals doing weird things. It's a villager's subconscious, you can say. You're actually looking right into somebody's mind. I can tell you more about that inside of their mind, too. I can tell you that about 5% of the villagers' dreams are concerned with making love. How do I know such a thing? Well, we actually have a book of dreams from the village. It gives you a list of 400 or 500 dreams and gives you interpretations. So you can say, for example, that if you dream you're eating crocodile flesh, you're going to become a tax inspector. If you dream you're making love to your wife in public, bad, 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 anxiety dream, that is. So, there's a lot of anxiety in the dreams, by the way. Can you imagine 15% of them are about loss of face, fear that your words wouldn't be understood in a village. So, you've got to think of our villager laying in bed. Bang, he has this awful dream. He wakes up. He's, oh my God, there's a terrible interpretation in the papyrus. What can I do? Well, the papyrus actually tells you what you can do. What you do is, you get up, you go down to the cellar, and you eat a lot of bread, and drink a lot of beer, and you have a prayer. Oh God, Isis, don't let it happen to me. And right through the villagers' most secret thoughts, and during their most private acts, there was a single God who looked deep into their hearts. The village oracle was an especially sacred statue of the King Amenhotep I, the man who had founded the village, and probably who laid in the first tomb the villagers ever made. His shrine was the most revered, set high amongst the other temples of the village. It was from there that the statue was sometimes carried by the villagers on little processions, like the great statue of Amun-Ra at Karnak. It took him, for instance, to the Valley of the Kings. There he would be carried over the mountains with all the workmen laughing and singing in front of the statue. When they got to the valley, they'd put the god down and have a good drink and eat the special cakes they'd made. Good time was had by all, and they brought the god back at night. It was like a little outing for him. But probably the most important function of the god was as a sort of a safety valve for the village problems, because people used to ask the god questions. Sometimes, for example, he'd be taken down the village high street, and there people would come out of their houses and ask the god, who has taken my mat? Or, will my boy get promotion? Or, how long will my father live? And the god would answer them. And it was on one of these occasions that a sculptor came out of the house and asked the god to find his stolen clothes. So the village magician was sent for. He walked along in front of the procession, and as they passed each house, he shouted out the name of its owner. The house of Kaha, the house of Senejum, the house of Nefer. And then slowly, as the procession moved down this part of the high street, ground to a halt here, right in front of Scribe Amunach's house. Must have been a terrifying moment for him. After all, there was this god accusingly standing outside his front door. And he rushed out, and he addressed the god directly. He said, these clothes of which you speak, did my daughter really take them? And the god said that she had. So you can imagine the rather crestfallen scribe went back inside, saw his daughter, and together sorted out the clothes and gave them back to the man who'd accused them. Now, we don't actually know whether these clothes were in some sort of a dispute or whether his daughter was a thief. That's as far as the story goes. But how, you may ask, did the god actually manage to say yes or no to anything? How did the stone statue move? Well, what really happened was that as the bearers moved with the god, his power came into their shoulders. So as they marched down the high street, in this particular part, the statue pressed down on them so hard that they couldn't move. And when Amennacht asked his question, the answer was indicated by the god nodding backwards and forwards. That's how the god delivered his verdict. Such strange things still happen at Luxor, which is a part of ancient Thebes, built on it indeed. Take that mosque over there, Mosque of Abul Hajjaj. That's built in amongst the columns of the Luxor temple. As many Egyptologists would like to know what it says on the texts that are buried in the walls of the mosque. So they must have been pretty delighted when in about 1935, King Farouk donated the mosque on which I'm standing to hold the remains of the great saint who was buried in the mosque. And a strange thing happened when the engineers turned up to move the saint, the old man who'd come from Baghdad to convert all of Luxor to Islam. They found that when they approached his tomb to lift his body and bring it to his new mosque, that they froze, they couldn't move. It's exactly the same thing that happened when the pallbearers carrying the oracle went past Amennacht's house. They froze too. It's exactly the same situation. And as the oracle pointed the finger at Amennacht's daughter, so the old saint still lies in his tomb. And the Egyptologists are still wondering what's buried underneath it. When Amennacht first became a scribe to work in the royal tombs, the artists were in the doldrums. You get the feeling when you look at their work, because this is all was done about that time, that they were really knocking it out. The life had gone out of the work. And that really is the severest test of Egyptian art. Does the guy look like he's alive? Does the eye look like it might see you? Does the arm look like it might move? Well, I think if you look at this arm very quickly, you'll see that this angle there is so badly drawn, it just doesn't articulate properly. It doesn't look as if it could ever swing. That's because the first process in this work was badly done. These walls, you see, were left white, and then the master draftsman came in and drew the lines that the sculptors would then engrave on the wall. The ancient Egyptians described it, they said, outline draftsman, then graven by chisels, and then coloured. And that's what you've got here. But look, the outline draftsman is really not too worried about the king as a living man. He's just earning his bread, shuffling quickly round the face, miserable little lips that you can hardly see, a snake that's wobbling around on a little thin stick and isn't really alive, an ugly, clunking wig. All this contrives to turn it into a rubber stamp for us, I think. Amennacht himself was a painter, and he designed and painted coffins all his life, even after he became scribe. And you can see his impact in the tombs in the 20 years he worked here. In fact, together with his sons, one of whom became the master colour artist, he really oversaw a renaissance in the royal tombs, so that this poor and miserable and lifeless figure blossomed into the wonderful paintings of the later kings. This is probably the only tomb in the Valley of the Kings where you can actually see the master draftsman working on a wall. It's my favourite tomb in the valley, actually. It's probably one of the greatest tombs of Egyptian art. It's still a bit secret. Not many people know about this tomb or its wonderful drawings. It's the tomb of this man, a bit bashed up here, Prince Montu Herkopeshe, a man who was in charge of the royal chariotry. But it's the artists that are more interesting than the prince here, really. Let's just look at one line. That's how you really get to see the quality of these painters. Look at this arm here, it runs down, runs along, and then in another colour it starts up there again. Now the artist, before he made that line, because that line takes a second and a half, has thought that this wonderful costume that the prince is wearing is just going to pull slightly on the king's arm, so the skin is moved down slightly. That's really thinking about it. Before you make the move, you think, I want this quality and I want that quality, and you have the skill in your arm to be able to do it in one single stroke. That's amazing. Actually, it's not just a quality of thought and action, because these guys actually had to make their own paints and brushes. There weren't no tubes about in those days. So all these lovely colours here were ground up on pallets, probably several days before they actually came to work in the tomb. And they did this old test, and it still works for paint today, you know. You get a little dab of the paint, and you put it between two fingernails, and you rub your fingernails together, and you feel the grit there. It's not ground enough, and you have to grind it for another 4 or 5 hours. When it is ground finely enough, and you've left it, then you have to let it stand in the water for a couple of days, because if you don't, when you start drawing these vast long lines here, the little brushes that you use just filter the water from the pigment, and you're left with a line of water. So this is not just incredible skill you're looking at, it's also great sophistication and knowledge of your craft. And what an amazing sophistication it is too. These lines run for feet after feet after feet in one stroke. That means that the man actually has control in his arm and his arm muscles, almost like a dancer. And that's what this brush is doing really, is just sort of dancing through the air. Look at this line down the front of the face here. Very quick, very sharp. He knows exactly where he's going, and he's got the control from the end of his brush to his arm, like a samurai warrior, you know. I mean, you can just do it. That's really amazing brushwork. And he's thinking all the time. See, these wigs are made of wool, so to get a nice edge to describe their texture, the artist has mixed a bit more water with his paint. He's run it loosely down the edge, and that really has all the textures on the person are described. The sharp gold necklace, the little tassel that wrinkles on it, that holds it, the tassels of the robe. It's all carefully described, carefully worked out with great thought. So, that's the attention this lucky prince got by his artists. Here you can see him in a succession of scenes. He's worshipping gods, the prince worshipping one god after another down the wall. And you know, in the end, the most amazing thing about this tomb is that you can date it so accurately, that this prince is stuck like a fly in amber. Because these scenes have been going on for thousands of years. They're timeless. But this prince, with all his nice new clothes, and his great wigs and his special jewellery, he comes from 1140 BC, exactly.
By Muntu Herkopeshef's time, some 20 kings have been entombed in the Royal Valley. It must have been the greatest treasure chest of the ancient world, the Fort Knox of its day. Imagine the incredible wealth, gold and precious stones, all quarried from the mountains of Egypt, reburied in these cliffs. Gold, the very skin of the gods. And there were plenty of Thebans and foreigners brave enough to try to rob the dead kings, and not to collect their treasure either, but to smash it up and smelt it down. Ranged against the thieves was a police force. Before the modern road was cut, the entrance to the Royal Valley looked like this. A small stairway leading to a narrow cleft in a rock face. And around the closed valley, a ring of little watchtowers looked down upon the royal tombs. The valley was so quiet that any sound, a footfall, a chisel's blow, would rise like the whisperings in a cathedral dome. The royal tombs stood open to view, shut off from the world only by thin cedar doors. But in fact, much more guarded these ancient kings than these snakes, spitting their magic venom at ancient thieves. For the police regularly inspected the door seals and would have quickly detected a break-in.
So the robbers had to find other ways into the royal tombs. They either made their own tunnels or came in through other doors, through old tombs, long since empty. It was in the very last chamber of the old tomb that the robbers found what they had come for.
was this, a pile of chippings. And at the back of the pile of chippings, some plaster and some stone rudely stuffed into a hole. And this hole, they knew, led down into a royal tomb beneath them. That's where they broke through. Then the men all tumbled down their rope, jumped onto the floor of the royal tomb. And then, of course, it was just a short scramble through here, down to the doors of the royal burial chamber. All that stood between them and the king lying in his burial chamber was a thin cedar wood door which stood here, with small seals which they broke, threw the door open, and the probably frightened men by now tumbled down these steps into the royal burial chamber. In the centre stood the king, and around him all the goods of his court. I suppose they quickly stripped those, but the real nut, the real pearl of the whole piece was the mummy of the king himself lying inside his sarcophagus. So they pushed the lid off, and it smashed as it hit the floor, and I'm standing on the bits. They took the royal body out, tore into the mummy bandages, stripped all the jewellery from him, ripped off the royal heart scarab, took the bracelets from his wrists, and all the gold leaves that were down his body, threw that to one side, discarded, took his coffins, which were still covered in gold, and took them from the tomb to spoil at their leisure. Thieving was now widespread throughout the ancient cemeteries of Egypt. Most of the gangs included a boatman who would ferry the thieves away from the plundered graves, sometimes landing them upon an island where they would set fire to their loot and distribute the melted drops of gold amongst themselves. Fortunately, old scribe Amennax had not lived to see the plunder of the royal tombs, but his son, scribe Harshiri, had, and he was very worried. For some of the robbers were tomb makers, members of his own family who lived in the village. And although Thebes was a large city, it was a tight-knit community. Gossip spread through it like wildfire. It was very difficult to keep secrets. In an effort to forestall the arrest of the villagers, Harshiri hit upon a cunning scheme. He would pass off the villagers' crime upon other gangs of tomb robbers. So he made an official report to the mayor of Thebes, telling that the royal tombs had been robbed, forcing him to investigate. A grand committee was convened and crossed the river, travelling all around the myriad royal cemeteries, examining the seals upon the tomb's doors in a 2-day inspection. The tomb makers held their breath. Then the news spread. Through the temples and into the village, they were in the clear. They must have sighed with relief. But then it was that they made their fatal mistake. Not knowing scribe Harshiri's plan, they all piled into ferry boats and crossed the river to confront the mayor, the man who they thought had been their accuser, in a great victory celebration. So the villagers poured down here to the temple at Karnak, down this very path, in a great happy mob. Actually, it's really a political expression because they were celebrating the uncomfortable defeat of their accuser, the mayor. They're out to find his house now for a celebration in front of it. Well, the mayor's house has long gone to dust. But certainly within a few feet of where I'm walking at the moment. What we do have, and perhaps there's even more remarkable, is the record of the exact conversation that passed between him and the angry villagers. Well, they got to the house, and there was one hell of a row. The mayor came to the door and met them and said, "You have rejoiced at me over the very door of my house. What do you mean by it? I'm the prince who reports to the king." But by now the villagers were in full flight, and they said, "All the kings, together with their royal wives and their royal mothers and the royal children who rest in the great and noble necropolis," that's the Valley of the Kings, "are protected and insured forever and ever." And now the mayor was very angry, because he knew they had been robbing the tombs, and he said then, "Your deeds belie your words." And at that moment, really, they'd sealed their own fate, because the mayor was going to get them. The first thing he did was to isolate the village. Despite all Scribe Harshiri's frantic efforts, the donkey trains that brought their food were stopped, and the villagers, dependent upon the state for their food, slowly began to starve. A beady eye was fixed on the villagers, and their movements were restricted. The thieves' loot, still in the village houses, could not now be moved or hidden. And then disaster struck. They had a house-to-house search of the village, and they found a lot of gold and silver. And as usual, they didn't actually arrest the bosses, of course, but the deputy foreman and 3 members of each gang. And then they brought them and their loot here, across the river. They imprisoned them in a temple. And that is what I'm looking for. Yeah, that's what we come to see. Here's the king. Here's his name. Here's his hands. And here, a bit bashed up, is a goddess. In her hat, she wears a feather. Now, this feather is a feather that when you die and are called up for judgment, goes on one half of a pair of scales, just like the scales on the Old Bailey, right? And on the other side goes your heart. And if the feather weighs more than your heart, the crocodile eats you up. And that, of course, is why the men came here, because this is her temple. It's the temple of justice, the temple of Mart. And this is where they imprison the 8 villagers. Can you imagine? Poor old Scribe Harshiri came across the river and sat probably on this very stone and looked through the grill. There was a door there, you see, and he looked through the grill. And he thinks, despite all his efforts, they've got them. They've got a lot of members of his family, really. They've got his younger brother and his 3 sons, got an uncle and his 3 sons. And the scribe's helpless, he can do nothing. And that evening he goes away. And then for 24 days, those guys are questioned, and they are questioned, and lists are made, and lists, and their arms are twisted, because this is not a court of law, really. They're not actually deciding whether these guys are guilty or innocent. What they're doing is trying to get the loot back. So that's why they're making these lists all the time. And really, in the end, the terrible agony they're going through, because it is agony, it's pretty bad torture, the end only comes when they've got that money back. Well, what did you do in 1107 BC when you won the pools? Because that's about what these guys had done. They ripped off a jackpot, really. When you think that the foreman had made about 50 years' salary, and the other robbers with him had made about 25 years, that's a lot of money together. So the lists that they made, the confessions, are absolutely fascinating. It's like a cross-section of Theban life, really. So what did they do with all their loot? Well, they came from a poor village, so with some of it they bought food. But after all, food was still relatively inexpensive. So there were lots of other things they could get. They went out and bought themselves new linen clothes, lovely sandals. They bought good strong beer, meat, cooking oil, all sorts of wonderful things. And from all the women that are on the records, without apparently performing any function, you can imagine a good deal of wine, women and song went on as well.
But those days were over now. The 8 men were taken back across the river, but they never went back to their village. Probably, in the end, they were tied to wooden stakes in the desert and simply left to die. And even after this, the villagers were not let off the hook.
The vizier saw to it that they had no rations for another 3 weeks, and they starved. Then one day he turned up again in Thebes and brought the whole village here to the Valley of the Queens. He was going to teach them a lesson at first hand. Brought them to this tomb here, the very tomb that the 8 men robbed. There's its door. Of course, the tomb door looked nice and shut. There's nice white ceilings down the front, absolutely untouched, unrobbed, it so seemed. Because, of course, if you remember, the 8 men had got in the back of the tomb to rob it. So the vizier had the door took down. And to nobody's surprise, of course, the inside was smashed to fragments. The sarcophagus was in pieces, the coffins were smashed up and everything. The villagers must have looked very shamefaced indeed. And the vizier turned on them and said, "Don't do that again." And he let them have their rations because they've been starving now for a long time.
But the villagers' humiliation did not stop there. Although the vizier had restored their rations, the donkey trains did not come to the village bringing their food. And still starving, the villagers walked down from their village, past the great state temples, and across the green fields to the vizier's state barge that was moored at the riverbank. And there they pleaded with him. And then, and only then, he finally relented and gave them bread from his own food stores and ordered them back to work immediately. And in the paintings the village artists made at this time in the king's tomb, something of the nightmare of those months remains. The royal underworld seems haunted by spectres of the villagers' own sufferings.